And one more time, let's show our appreciation to the Reinhardt University Chamber Choir. Thank you. I just need to add one little thing to the children's sermon. I think if you wear red and black, that might show people that you're wearing God's favorite colors. Do I have an amen? And those who disagree are not Christian. All right. Just tease it, just sort of. Okay. It's so good to see you on this Lord's Day. So good to have you, and great music is always in this church. The name Samuel Langhorne Clemens rings a bell with us. We know him better by his pen name, Mark Twain. He was born in 1835. He wrote The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, and he's often been called Huckleberry Finn is the great American novel. He grew up in Hannibal, Missouri, and you know that name. Everybody knows Mark Twain's from Hannibal, Missouri, because that's where The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn began. He became a printer early in his life. Then he became a riverboat pilot. And then later on in his life, he wrote a little story that got international recognition. And he earned praise from critics and peers, and he became friends to presidents of the United States, artists, industrialists, and European royalty. He's been lauded as the great American humorist, the great American humorist. And William Faulkner called him the father of American literature. But what the average person does not know about Mark Twain is behind that smile was a man who lived a very dark, dark life. He had a profound sense of guilt and sadness and darkness throughout his life. He would write, those awful nights, nights of despair, nights charged with the bitterness of death, night brings me deep remorse, end of quote. Samuel Clemens' father died when he was 12. The woman who raised him, who helped raise him with his mother, was a slave named Jenny. And his father sold her to a man who was a notorious slave owner with a reputation for being horrible to slaves. And he felt a deep sense of guilt that his father would do such a thing. When he was a little boy, one of his closest friends, they were playing in the river, who can hold your breath the longest underwater, and his friend did not come up. And he dove down only to find his friend had gotten caught in a net, and he brought his deceased body to shore. When he was 17 years of age, he was walking by the jail, and a prisoner called out and said, "Can you give me a light for my pipe?" Well, this was before Twain started smoking his cigars and his pipes, and he went and spent his own money and bought a box of matches. And he handed it to the prisoner through the bars of the prison cell. And the man not only struck the light his pipe, but Twain didn't know that this man was inebriated, and he caught his cell on fire. And nobody could get him out, and Mark Twain watched him burn to death. And he always felt he was responsible for that man's death. His sister Margaret died from fever at the age of 9. 3 years later, his brother Ben died. His brother Henry died a few years after that from an explosion on a ship. And Twain and his wife would take his deceased brother's children under their wings, and they would go visit them. And one night he took his deceased brother's son on a carriage ride and did not realize the little boy was not clothed properly for such a cold evening, and the little boy got diphtheria and died, and Twain blamed himself the rest of his life. Following the publication of Huckleberry Finn, Twain and his wife and one of his 3 daughters went on an around-the-world trip, for he lectured all over the world. On their voyage back to America, he received word that his oldest daughter had died at home of spinal meningitis. Twain would later write near the end of his life, "I have no faith at all." His darkness and anger over all that he had been through in life soured him against God. His wife, who was a faithful churchgoer, Twain managed to inspire her to have no faith, and she died without a faith in God, and he added that to his plate of guilt and darkness. He would later write these horrific words: "There is no God, no universe, no human race, no earthly life, no heaven, no hell. It's all a dream, a grotesque and foolish dream. Nothing exists but you, and you're but a thought. The human race has only one real effective weapon: laughter." End of quote. Mark Twain lived and died in the dark. In the dark. I've been in the ministry 36 years, and I've had people to call me when they were in the dark. Sometimes it's night, sometimes it's in the morning, sometimes in the daytime, but they're in the dark. And when a person picks up the phone to call me or another clergy, I know they want to get out of the dark, because who wants to live in it? Who wants to live in the dark? Oh my goodness. My greatest sadness for Mark Twain is that he never went for help. He reminds me of a song that Smokey Robinson wrote, but I only remember Linda Ronstadt singing it. People say I'm the life of the party 'cause I tell a joke or two, although I might be laughing loud and hearty. Deep inside I'm blue, so take a good look at my face. You'll see my smile's a bit out of place. You know, if you look closely, it's easy to trace the tracks of my tears. The scripture that was read in your hearing this morning is about a man named Nicodemus. And what you need to know about Nicodemus was he was of the strictest order of Pharisees. He was a member of the Sanhedrin, which means he was a big shot. He was a big wheel. He had influence in community. He was one of those well-known people. And he had heard of Jesus. He had heard Jesus preach, maybe, and teach. And it says, it's interesting, that he went to Jesus by night. Did you notice those words in the reading? He went to Jesus by night. Now, we don't know. Most rabbis studied in the evening, so people often would visit rabbis at the night to talk. It can mean that he went and Jesus was at wherever he was staying. It was dark, but there are also scholars who believe that there was a lot on Nicodemus' heart, that he was living in darkness himself. And he says to Jesus, "Man, this is D. Shelnutt paraphrase, I've never known anyone who teaches the way you teach and preach the way you preach. I want to know about that." And Jesus looks at him and says, "Nick," I imagine he called him Nick, "Nick, you got to be born anew. You got to be born from above. You got to be born again." And old Nick is shocked by that, and he says, "How can that be? It's impossible. How can we go back into the mother's womb?" And see, this isn't written in the Gospel of John, but Jesus was thinking to himself, how can you be that dumb and be a Pharisee? That's not in the scriptures. I just want you to know. But see, Sanhedrin were very smart. They knew the Bible. They knew the law. They knew all of this. And I imagine Jesus going, "Are you that dumb? You're not getting it? You're not getting it, Nicodemus. You're not getting it." And basically what he's saying to him is, "Nick, you've got to start over. You got to be vulnerable. You got to be innocent. You got to be pure. You got to depend on God. You got to learn that your social position, your achievements, your wealth, your reputation, things like that make you self-sufficient. They can make you they can alienate you from God. And see, when you're born from above, all those things are not important. And you're going to seek truth. You're going to change, Nicodemus. You're not going to live the way you've been living. You got to change. Well, you know, people don't like change. People don't like the truth. You know, it's really true. The closer we get to truth, the more we want to run away from it. We don't really want truth. We don't want to change. You know, it's interesting. I don't like to unlearn what I've already learned. When I was growing up, my mother thought that to have a good breakfast, you had to have scrambled eggs, bacon, grits, biscuits with gravy on it. And that was a healthy breakfast. And then when I was about 18 or 19, we learned that eggs and bacon and biscuits with gravy are not good for you. And then we learned a few years ago that eggs are good for you. But now I'm not sure if they're good for you or not. Would someone tell me after church if eggs are good for you or not? I went to the scouting thing yesterday, and they served scrambled eggs, and I didn't eat any because I'm not sure where I am on that, you know? I'm still learning, and And then I've had, when I was a little boy, I used to play out in the sun. Never wore sunscreen, ever. You got to play outside. You got to get all that good sunshine. And now we say, oh, you can't go outside without sunscreen. I'm paying the price for it. You've got to have vitamin D. You've got to have the sun. We're learning and unlearning all the time. My mother used to get on to me for eating chocolate. Now we're told chocolate's good for you, particularly dark chocolate. Eat up. It's good for you. Dark chocolate. Now, you know what I learned also recently? Maple syrup. Now, I've had people say to me, that's all fattening, all that sugar in that maple syrup. Do you know maple syrup has 20 antioxidants in it? Go eat pancakes for lunch today. Have that maple syrup. Just enjoy it. You're going to fight cancer. You might get diabetes, but you're going to fight cancer with all that antioxidants. Ask anyone who discovered America. People are quick to say Christopher Columbus, but do you know what? There are a lot of holes in that story. We're learning. Not so fast. And by the way, his name wasn't Christopher Columbus. How about that? His name was Cristoforo Colombo. How do you discover a land that's already inhabited? The Vikings discovered the northern hemisphere in 1000 CE. Look at scientists who told us a few years ago that Pluto's not a planet. And I don't like that. Because that's the only planet I can remember other than Earth is Pluto. You know? They've taken Pluto away from us. I don't like it at all. I'm having to change my understanding of the solar system. I don't like it at all. And Jesus is saying to Nicodemus, you're going to have to change. You got to change what you've learned. Because all that you've learned is you're so adherent to the law that you have missed God. You've missed God. It's so much more than that. You got to change. And when you're born from above, you're going to see differently. You're going to see people differently. You're going to love differently. You're going to serve other people. My 2 youngest grandchildren are in the back today. They're 6 months and 5 months old. And I tell you, I love to be around newborns, those who have just come into the world. Because, see, they're so pure and innocent and vulnerable. And they depend on somebody to feed them, to clothe them, to love them. It's just wonderful. I love being around them some of the time. They're just, all of the time. Some of the time. You know what I mean? You know what I mean. I just love them. I love them with all my heart. And they're just so neat to be around. Everything fascinates them. It's like, look at this whole new world. It's a whole new world. And Jesus is saying to Nicodemus, that's what's going to happen to you when you're born anew. You're going to see the world differently. You're going to see it differently. And Nick just doesn't get it. And so Jesus says to him, it's like the wind, Nick. It's like the wind. But Jesus uses a word called ruach. And that same word for wind means spirit. And Nicodemus knows he's talking about the mystery of God. It's like the wind. The wind blows where it will. And you never know what's going to happen when the wind comes around us. It changes us. Wind always changes when it blows. It can mess up your hair. It can mess up your yard. Have you ever witnessed the Spirit blowing around someone? I want to tell you this. Recently, I saw the widow of a man named Bob who was in my church when I was a youth minister. He died while I was there, but his widow never remarried, and I saw her recently. She came to church here. And some of you may remember I've told this story years ago, but this is a classic. When I was a youth minister, I hadn't preached much. And the pastor was going out of town, and he asked me to preach one Sunday. And I have to tell you, it was the worst sermon I've ever preached in my life. Even I was bored. It was horrible. Now, you might say, and this one might be right up there with it. I don't know. But anyway, it was horrible. Worst sermon I've ever preached. I was so ashamed. I was so upset. I mean, it was dead. And who comes to my office but this man named Bob? Now, you have to understand, Bob was retired military. He was married, never had children. Bob never smiled. He was Mr. Rigorous, always was impeccably dressed, never smiled, never said anything to anybody. He would go to church, go home. You never saw him other than Sunday morning church. He was always glum looking. He comes to my office. Never had come to my office. Never said 2 words to me. And he said, I want to tell you how that worship experience today was exciting. And I thought, yeah, Bob, go ahead. What's only you would think such a thing. And he said, I've just felt the Spirit of God leading me to come to talk to you. I want to work with the youth. No, no, that was not the Spirit of God, Bob, I promise you. No. And I thought, you will run those young people away. Never smile. I want to work with the young people. I just feel the Spirit of God. That's how he taught us. I want to feel the Spirit. And I was like, oh, please, help us now. He said, can I come tonight? I thought, this is getting worse by the minute. I said, okay, Bob, come on to youth. And he did. He just sat over in the corner. Didn't say anything to anybody, didn't do anything. And so I went up to him and I said, Bob, how do you want to help with the youth? He said, well, I can drive the bus. When are you taking the youth on a trip or anything? I said, well, we go like tonight. We'll go to someone's house and we have what's called Destination Unknown. I don't know if y'all remember doing that. When I was a youth, we would go to someone's home and surprise them. The youth never knew where they were going. He said, I'll drive the bus. He began driving the bus for us. And pretty soon, he began to, instead of sitting out in the bus when the youth went in to bowl or whatever, he would come in. And then, God is my witness, one day he was playing volleyball. I never thought I'd see Bob playing volleyball. And pretty soon, those little 6th and 7th grade girls were all over him, just loving on him. And you would see him smile. He even laughed. I saw him laugh. And pretty soon, he became an instrumental part of the youth program. And the youth sat in a body in the front of the church with tears streaming down their faces at his funeral because they loved him. And he showed them God in ways I would never have been able to. The wind blows where it will. You just never know what's going to happen when the wind blows. We have a person in this church, before I ever came to pastor this church, whose wife drug him to church. He didn't want to come to church at all. But he came, and the wind began to blow in his life. And over 20 years, he's been teaching youth Sunday school in this church. Same with disciple leaders. Same with mission leaders. Same with many people. The wind blows where it will. You never know. When I was a college student, I was a sophomore in college, it was right near the spring of my sophomore year. Even though I was raised in the church and I've always loved the church and had been born anew, you know, I was a math major, wanted to be an architect. And I felt the Spirit blowing upon me in such a strong way. I felt God calling me, called forth to be in ministry. I didn't want to do it. I have to tell you, I didn't want to do it. Because being born anew isn't always easy. But I'll never forget the night on that campus I said yes to God. I'll do it. I'll be your man. But I didn't tell anybody for 9 whole months. 9 months. And then the time came to be delivered. The time came when I had to tell somebody, like my parents, that I was not going to architectural school, that I was going to seminary. And I knew once the words were out of my mouth that it would change the dynamics in my family. It would change the dynamics in my fraternity. I was a Kappa Sig before the call. And it has enhanced my ministry tremendously to have been in a fraternity, I want you to know. And then I told the fraternity. And it was the most terrifyingly awesome experience to tell someone I'm going in the ministry. And I've never looked back, and the ministry has been the greatest joy of my life. I've seen people here that the wind has swept across. Some didn't feel it, but they did. And they came in here full of anger and hate and bitterness. And the Spirit of God came, and they were born anew to know peace and forgiveness and God's redeeming love. I've known people who came in this place who were selfish and self-centered. And the Spirit of God swept upon them. And they've become great givers. It isn't my job as the pastor to raise the money in this church, and this isn't a stewardship sermon, but I'm going to give a quick little something. I want to challenge us not to live in darkness and not to live in fear in giving. I want to challenge us all to be born anew and to be born from above in our giving, to take a step in faith. Do you know that churches need to be born anew? Entire congregations need to be born from above. We need to be continually born from above. And I want to challenge all of you, not just to give, not just to take this and say, well, okay, I think, and I'm praying that the Spirit of God will sweep across every person here and every person that calls this church their church home, that we have 100% of people put in something on this pledge card. Even if it's $1 a week, let's have 100%. Let's be born anew in our giving. Pray about it. Pray about it. What are you going to give? And let's together do something greater for God. I'm coming to the close. Jesus has talked to Nick about all these things. And then do you know what he ends with in the conversation? He starts talking to Nick about snakes. Did you catch that in the reading? Nicodemus, the Son of Man needs to be lifted up. Lifted up. Just like Moses lifted the serpent up in the wilderness. Well, if you go back and read the Exodus story, when they were in the wilderness, the people disobeyed God. They had gotten away from God. And snakes started coming from all areas, and they were biting them and killing the people. And Moses cried out to God, and God said, make an image of a serpent and put it on a pole and lift it up. And Moses looked around, and he created a serpent in bronze, and he put it on a pole and lifted it up. And everybody who looked up to the serpent was saved. Everyone who had been bitten by a snake, when they looked up, were healed. They were delivered from sickness and death. And Jesus is saying, Nick, that's what you got to do when you're born anew. You got to look up to God. You got to look up to the one who can save you from yourself, from the venom of yourselves. We would say Jesus is the great serpent who heals us, delivers us, and frees us, sets us free through redemption and salvation. We don't really know what happened to Nicodemus. He left Jesus' house that night, went back to where he lived, I guess. But I wonder how he went back. I wonder when he left the home of Jesus and he was riding back, if he paid a little more attention to the poor, to the abused, to the least, to the last, and the lost. I wonder if the words of Jesus changed his life. I wonder if he was born anew. Well, what about you and me? Isn't it time we remember to always look up? Too many people come into church, they look down. Too many people in life look down, they need to look up. We need to look up to the cross of Jesus Christ, to the one who can make us new, the one that we can come and say, I'm feeling dark inside, will you bring me light? And Christ always brings light. We don't have to live like Mark Twain. We can come to the one who can turn our darkness into light, our sadness and despair into joy, our deaths into life eternal. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. Do you believe it? Do you believe it? Do you know this Christ real in your life so much that he sets you free to be vulnerable and pure and dependent on God? Will you go home today differently than when you came here? Will you let go of all that's unhealthy in life and know the one who can save your souls? Amen.